The storm that gave Niels Halverson back to his wife arrived on the first Tuesday of October. 2019, 51 years after the storm that took him. It came down out of Ontario the way the big ones always did, dragging a wall of slate-colored water ahead of it, and it beat against the shore of Kalvik, Minnesota. For 2 days and a night, all that summer, Lake Superior had been running higher than anyone in town could remember, higher than the concrete footings of the old fish house, high enough that the county had trucked in riprap to save the road. The waves had been gnawing at the mouth of the bay since June, pulling away mud and gravel that had lain undisturbed for decades, opening up the bottom a little more with every gale. When the wind finally died on Thursday morning, Arne Vik's grandson took his skiff out to check his lines, and 200 yards off the Halverson dock, in 11 feet of suddenly clear water, he saw a shape that did not belong there. He cut the motor and drifted over it. Then he sat very still for a long time, because he was a Kalvik boy, and every Kalvik boy knew the name painted on that hull before he was old enough to read it. Solveig. Edith Halverson heard about it the way she had heard about everything in that town for 72 years, from someone standing on her porch with their hat in their hands, not quite able to look at her. This time it was the sheriff, a man young enough to be her grandson, and behind him, at the bottom of the steps, stood Pastor Dahl and old Arne Vik himself, 91 years old, leaning on his grandson's arm. "Mrs. Halverson," the sheriff said, "we found the Solveig." Edith stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame. Behind her, in the front room, sat the chair. "Where?" Edith said. It was not a question the way she said it. It was a word she had been saving. Arne Vik lifted his head then, and his voice came up the steps thin and cracked but steady. 50 years of storms, he said, and it's a storm that gives him back. They raised her the following week. It was not a complicated salvage. The water was shallow, and what was left of the Solveig was wedged in a rock channel at the mouth of the bay, packed in mud, her hull broken but her shape unmistakable. A barge crane came up from Duluth. Divers went down with straps. Half the town stood on the shore in the cold, and Edith stood with them, in her gray wool coat, with her daughter Ingrid's hand under her arm. Ingrid Halverson was 50 years old. She had been born in April of 1969, 5 months after her father's boat failed to come home. And she had spent her whole life in a town that looked at her a certain way, the way you look at the child of a story. She was a practical woman, an accountant in Duluth, divorced, gray coming in at her temples, and she had driven up the shore the morning the sheriff called and had not gone home since. The crane took the strain. The water at the mouth of the bay heaved once, like something breathing, and then the bow of the Solveig came up out of Lake Superior into the gray October light, black with mud, streaming water, her name still legible in flaked white paint. A sound went through the crowd on the shore, low and involuntary. Edith did not make a sound at all. She watched her husband's boat hang in the air, turning slowly. 51 years late, and her face was as still as the face of the lake in January. They set the wreck on timber cribbing in the boatyard, and a conservation crew from the Maritime Museum in Duluth came to stabilize it, and on the second day, when they pumped the mud out of the flooded cabin, they found the things that changed everything. The first things were the life vests. There were 2 of them, canvas and cork, rotted nearly black. One, a big man's vest, lay stowed in the flooded cabin where a vest belongs. The other was found outboard, lashed to a broken stanchion on the port rail with a single deliberate turn of line, knotted the way a fisherman knots. The crew chief noticed something odd about that second vest and said it aloud without thinking. And by supper time, the whole town knew its straps had been taken up short, adjusted small. It had been fitted for someone considerably slighter than Niels Halverson, who had stood 6'2" in his boots. 2 vests, 2 people. The second thing was in the cabin, wedged under the port bench where the mud had packed around it and sealed it like a jar, a small steel footlocker. A sea chest. Not Niels's. Edith was asked, and shook her head once. Slowly, Niels's gear chest was wooden, and it had sat in the Halverson shed since 1968 because he hadn't taken it that night. They opened the footlocker on a tarp in the boatyard shed, with the sheriff present, and Edith and Ingrid standing by. The clothes inside had gone to dark felted lumps, half a century of lake water pressed into them. Trousers, shirts, a pair of leather boots, small size 8, maybe 9. Men's clothes, young men's clothes, and folded at the bottom. heavy with water but whole. A wool jacket that had once been maroon and white, a school jacket, a letterman's jacket, the kind every boy in the county had worn to Friday games, with a felt patch sewn to the breast that the mud had covered and the water had, by some accident of chemistry, preserved. The conservator sponged it clean with the tenderness of a nurse, and the letters came up out of the black, stitched in cracked white thread, Calvik, class of '67. The shed was very quiet. Ingrid heard her own heartbeat. She looked at the jacket, and then she looked at her mother, and what she saw frightened her, because Edith's face had finally moved. Something had come into it that Ingrid had never seen there in 50 years. Not grief. Grief had lived there for decades, but something older and colder underneath the grief, waking up. Because here is what the town of Calvik had said about Niels Halverson for 51 years. They had said it in the aisles of Lund's grocery and on the church steps and across fence lines. Quietly, kindly. With terrible pity he ran off. There was no body because there was no drowning. A man that good with a boat doesn't drown a mile from his own dock. He had somewhere to be and someone to be there with, and he left that poor girl with a baby coming. And the storm was just his cover. Edith had raised her daughter inside that story like a house she couldn't leave. And now the lake had handed up his boat, less than a mile from home, with a packed sea chest that wasn't his, with a second life vest, strapped small. By Friday, the story was already reassembling itself in the town's mouth, the way it always had, into the old comfortable shape you see. There was someone with him after all. But Ingrid stood in the boatyard shed looking at the letterman's jacket drying on its rack, and the arithmetic in her ran cold and clean, the way numbers always ran for her. Her father had been 26 years old in November of 1968, a married man, a fisherman. Whoever had packed that chest and worn that jacket had been 18, 19 years old, a boy barely out of Calvik High School. Her father had not run off with a woman. There had never been a woman. On the night the Solveig went down, there had been a boy on her deck, and somewhere in the long silence of that town, somebody had always known it. That night Edith Halverson sat in her kitchen with the lamp off, and through the doorway to the front room she could see the chair by the window, a black shape against the last gray light off the water. She had been 21 years old when she started waiting. She was 72 now. She had waited through the pity and through the whispers, through her mother-in-law's cold funerals of the heart, through 51 Novembers of other people's husbands coming home. She had kept the chair facing the bay because the bay was the last place he had been true, the place he'd gone out from, and if the town was right, if he had run, then the chair faced the direction of her shame, and she had kept it there anyway, because she had never once believed them. Almost never. There had been nights. She would not pretend, even to herself, that there had not been nights. Ingrid came and stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on. "Mom," she said, "somebody in this town knows who that boy was." Edith looked out the dark window a while. "Somebody in this town," she said at last, "has known it for 51 years, and they stood in the grocery line behind me, and they let me carry it." She turned from the window, and in the dark her voice was very quiet and very level, and Ingrid understood that her mother had not been waiting all these years the way the town thought soft and faithful and broken. She had been waiting the way ice waits on a roofline. "Find out his name," Edith said. "Calvik, Minnesota. The fall of 1968. The kitchen was warm and yellow with kerosene light, and Niels Halverson sat at the table after supper with his sleeves rolled up. Whittling. He was always whittling that fall. He'd come in off the water smelling of fish and gasoline, wash to the elbows, eat whatever Edith set in front of him like a man shoveling coal into a furnace, and then, instead of the radio or the nets that needed mending, he'd take a scrap of clear pine from the pocket of his coat and turn it over in his big hands and go at it with his knife. Slow, careful, his tongue at the corner of his mouth like a schoolboy. "What is it?" Edith asked him. The first week of October. She was 4 months along by then, just beginning to show. And she had reached the stage where she wanted to know everything, hold everything, count everything twice. Niels closed his hand around the little shape and put it behind his back, and he smiled at her, that slow smile that came up out of him like the sun coming up out of the lake. That had made her, at 19, walk straight past 3 farm boys with better prospects. "Not yet," he said. "Niels, not yet. Shara, it isn't finished." She swiped at him with the dish towel and he ducked, laughing. And later that night, lying against his back in the dark, she felt him breathing and thought, I'm the luckiest woman on this shore. She was 21 years old. She is entitled to have thought it. It was true. One evening in the middle of the month, he asked her, out of nothing, not looking up from the wood, if it's a girl, what would you want to call her? Edith had her answer the way you have answers you don't know you've been keeping. Ingrid, she said, for my grandmother. Niels nodded, slow, as if a matter of state had been settled. He didn't say anything else. But she saw him, a few nights later, bent close to the lamp with the knife tip working at something small and fine on the flank of the hidden thing, and when he saw her watching, he covered it with his hand and grinned and said it again, softly, like the chorus of a song they were writing together. Not yet. The storm came on this 9th of November, a Saturday. It had been forecast for 2 days, which is why what happened made no sense to anyone. Then or after, no fisherman on that shore took a boat out into a November gale on Superior. November was the month the lake collected its rent. Every family in Kalvik had paid it at one time or another, a grandfather, an uncle, a name on the bronze plaque at Zion Lutheran. And the men who lived long enough to retire were the men who had learned to sit in their kitchens in November and let the lake rage at an empty horizon. Niels spent that Saturday securing the Solveig at the dock, doubling her lines. He took the little wrapped shape down with him when he went. The blue paint had come in from Duluth that week, and the boathouse was where a man painted, and when he came in at dusk his hands were empty. In the toolbox, a board, he said, when Edith raised an eyebrow. Out of your reach. Snoop, I'll finish her tomorrow, after church. He ate his supper. He was quiet, which was not unusual, and he kept looking out the window at the weather, which was not unusual either. At 8:30, there was a knock at the door, and Niels went out onto the porch to answer it, and Edith, drying dishes, heard the voices go down the steps and out toward the road 2 men, the wind taking the words away. She could not see who it was. She never saw who it was. It was 10 minutes, no more. Then Niels came back inside, and something had changed in his face, the way weather changes on the water, and he went to the closet and took down his oilskins. Niels, there's a thing I have to do, he said, for a friend. It's blowing 40 out there. It'll blow 40 whether I'm on the water or in this kitchen. He was pulling his boots on, quick, certain, and he must have seen her face, because he stopped and came across the kitchen and took her head in both his hands the way he did, as if he were holding something he'd been entrusted with. Hey, he said. Hey, look at me. I've run this shore and worse, in the dark, since I was 14 years old. I will be back before midnight. And here he smiled, and touched her belly with one flat hand, light as laying a leaf on water. Then I'm done with night errands forever. All right, man with a family has no business out at night. He kissed her on the forehead. At the door, he turned around. And this is the picture she kept. The one that hung in her for 51 years, Niels Halvorsen in his oilskins with the lamplight on him. One hand on the doorframe, big and sure and 26 years old, framed in yellow against the black. Before midnight, he said. The door shut. The wind took the sound of his boots off the porch, and the lamp flame leaned and stood straight again. Edith washed the last 2 dishes. She banked the stove. At 11, she moved the armchair his chair, the one he read the almanac in, over to the front window where she could watch for the Solveig's light coming back around the point. And she sat down in it to wait for her husband. She was still sitting in it at dawn. What came after came the way winter comes, not all at once, but permanently. They searched for 9 days. As much as the weather let them, they found 1 oar, 11 miles down the shore. They did not find the boat, and they did not find Niels. And on the 10th day, the sheriff, a different sheriff, that one, an old man with a drinker's face, stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, the first of all the men who would ever stand there like that, and told her they were calling it. The lake does not give up its dead. Everyone on that shore knew the saying. Superior is too cold and too deep. What it takes, it keeps. So there was no body, and no funeral, only a service of remembrance at Zion Lutheran that Edith sat through like a woman carved out of soap. 5 months pregnant, 21 years old, while the congregation sang Eternal Father, strong to save behind her in voices that were already, even then, beginning to murmur, because there was a problem with the story. And the town worried at the problem the way a tongue worries a broken tooth. Niels Halvorsen was the best boat handler on that shore. Everyone said so. That was the trouble. A man like that doesn't drown a mile from his own dock. And what was he doing out at all, on a November night? With a gale flagged since Thursday, A man doesn't leave a warm kitchen and a pregnant wife for nothing, unless the nothing was a something, unless the something had a name. No one ever said it to her face. That was the cruelty of it. It was a kindness. Their silence, a fur-lined, smothering kindness. But she saw it. She saw it in the pause before the checkout girl at Lund's met her eye. She heard it in the sudden way conversations reorganized themselves when she came into the church basement. Widows were held. Edith was handled. Somewhere in that first winter, without any meeting or memorandum, the town of Calvert quietly decided what had happened to Niels Halverson, and what had happened was he ran. The bank believed it. The bank believed it to the tune of the balance owing on the Solveig, which a missing man's wife was invited to satisfy or surrender collateral against. And there was no boat to surrender. So in March they took the truck. Edith walked to Lund's after that, 4 miles round trip, her belly out in front of her like the prow of a ship. Her mother-in-law believed it, which was the wound under the wound. Astrid Halverson had buried a husband to the lake and given it 2 brothers, and she knew, with the whole granite weight of her grief, that no storm had taken her Niels. My son knew that water like his own hand, she said to Edith, once, only once, across the kitchen table, in the flat voice of a woman handing down a verdict. So you tell me, then, what was wrong in this house, that he went looking somewhere else? Edith did not answer her. There was no answer. You cannot prove a negative to a grieving mother. You cannot prove it to a town. She stopped going to the Halverson farm after that. Astrid died in 1981, believing her son was alive somewhere, in Canada or the Dakotas, with a woman whose name she would never know, and in her will she left Edith $1, so that it could never be said she had been forgotten. And the church believed it, or rather, the church was taught it, a phrase and a Sunday at a time. And the teaching had a voice, and the voice belonged to Walter Brandt. Walter Brandt was 40 years old that winter, and he was Calvert Council of Zion Lutheran, school board, the feed store that held half the town's credit in its ledger, a tall, gray, upright man who wore his rectitude like a wool suit. His wife was dead. He had raised his son alone, strictly, publicly, a walking sermon on duty. And that winter, and for years after, Walter Brandt developed a theme. He would rise for the lay reading, or stand up at the men's breakfast. And his subject, with the reliability of the seasons, would find its way to steadfastness, to the men who stay, to and hear the pause, every time, like a stone dropped in still water, those who abandon their post and their obligations and leave others to carry what they would not. He never said the name. He never once said the name. He would simply let the pause open. And in the pause, the whole congregation would carefully not look at the third pew from the back, on the left, where Edith Halverson sat alone with her daughter. Ingrid grew up in that pew. She learned to read the hymnal early because the hymnal was a place to put her eyes. She was a smart, sturdy, watchful child. And by 10, she understood her situation with the pitiless clarity of children. She was the daughter of the man who ran off. And her mother was the woman who wasn't enough to keep him. And no amount of spelling bees would ever quite scrub it. At 17, she left for Duluth and told herself it was for school. And through all of it, through the bank and the walking and the $1 will, through 30 years of Walter Brandt's pauses, the chair stayed at the window, facing the bay. Edith could not have told you, in later years, exactly what the chair meant, because its meaning changed as she did. In the first year, it was simple. It was where she watched for his light. In the 5th year, it was defiance. The town could say what it liked. But in her front room, the vigil stood. By the 20th year, it had become something she didn't examine, a fact of the house, like the slope of the kitchen floor. She dusted it. She replaced the cushion once, in 1990, with one the same green, and she never, in 51 years, sat in it, because to sit in it would be to admit it was a chair, and it was not a chair. It was a spot on the shoreline of her life where a light was supposed to appear. Once, only once, Ingrid, 16, and furious about something else entirely, had shouted at her across the front room, "He's not coming back. Mom, turn the stupid chair around." Edith had gone very still. Then she'd said, in the mildest voice imaginable, the most terrible sentence Ingrid ever heard from her mother. "When somebody tells me the truth about that night, I'll turn it myself." October 2019. The Calvert School kept its yearbooks in a glass case in the library, and the librarian, who had been 3 years behind Ingrid, unlocked it without a word and left her alone at the long table with the 1967 volume. The Voyageur. Kalvik High School, 41 seniors, class of 1967, 19 of them boys, photographed in dark jackets and skinny ties, their hair combed wet, their faces heartbreaking in the way all such faces are. 18 years old, in the spring of 1967. Every one of them photographed just before the draft and the war began sorting their lives for them. Ingrid went through them with a legal pad, the way she went through a client's shoebox of receipts. It took her 4 days, the town clerk's memory, 2 phone calls, and a walk through Zion Lutheran Cemetery. And at the end of it, her pad said this: 19 boys, 8 still in the county alive, findable, accounted for. 4 moved away with their families before 1968, whereabouts established. 2 drafted, served, came home, one of those now in the Veterans Home in Silver Bay. 1 drowned before the storm. In June of '68 in the Baptism River, a swimming accident with witnesses, 1 in the cemetery since 2004, which left, at the bottom of the page, after 4 days of subtraction, 3 names, 3 boys of the Kalvik class of 1967 who had left town in the fall of 1968 and never, so far as anyone could tell her, come back. Gerald Acker, Daniel Lindqvist, Thomas Brandt. Ingrid sat looking at the third name for a long time. Then she drew a line under all 3, evenly, the way an accountant rules a column she doesn't trust yet, and took the pad home to her mother, Miss Carlson. She had been Miss Carlson for 45 years of school and remained Miss Carlson at 90. In the Lakeview Assisted Living in 2 Harbors, received Ingrid in a room full of African violets and looked at the yearbook photographs through a magnifying glass the size of a saucer. Gerald Acker, she said, and made a small sound. You can cross him off, dear. Gerald went to his mother's people in Fargo that fall. His father broke his back at the mill in October of '68, you won't remember, and the family scattered. He was in Fargo by Halloween. I had a Christmas card from his mother, complaining about him. The magnifying glass moved. Daniel Lindqvist enlisted, Navy, signed before they could draft him. His father drove him to Duluth himself. First week of November, made a little show of it at church. He came home in '72 and settled in the cities. He used to send the school a check every year. The glass stopped on the third photograph and didn't move. Thomas Brandt, Ingrid said. Miss Carlson set the magnifying glass face down on the table, deliberately, the way you turn down a card. Tommy Brandt, she said, was the gentlest boy I taught in 45 years. He was not built for this town, and he was certainly not built for that father. Walter used to come to conferences and ask me whether the boy was being toughened. She looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. He got his notice in October of '68, the draft notice. Everyone knew. The postmistress's daughter was in my home room. And then in November, right around the storm, he was simply gone. Walter stood up at church and said the boy had gone early to a college in Winnipeg, a Bible college. Her mouth did something brief and dry. In 50 years. That boy has never come home, not for Christmas, not for his mother's grave. That I ever heard. Walter Brandt has sat in the front pew of Zion Lutheran every Sunday for half a century, and his only son has never once sat beside him. Now what kind of college? Said Miss Carlson, picking her magnifying glass back up. Is that? The Sunoco at the junction had been Pearson's Sinclair in 1968, and Harold Pearson, 88, still lived behind it in the White House his father built. He talked to Ingrid on the porch, wrapped in a snowmobile jacket, and it took him a while to get anywhere near the point, because men of that shore approach a painful subject, the way you approach a moose obliquely and ready to stop. I was the last one that saw the Solveig go out, he said finally. I've said that to maybe 4 people in 50 years. Nobody ever wanted it, you understand. The story was already wrote. He spat, neatly, off the porch. Night of the 9th, I was in the station till late, on account of the storm folks coming in for kerosene and lamp oil. Around 9, I'm locking up, and I see a light down to the town dock. Then another one. 2 lights, 2 flashlights, moving around down there by the Halverson slip. Wind's coming up hard, and I think that's Niels, checking his lines. But who in God's name is the second man? Did you see them? Ingrid asked. Saw shapes. One big, one not big. He worked his jaw. And then the engine. I heard the Solveig turn over and knew her sound like I know my wife's cough, and I stood there in the doorway of my own station and watched her running lights go out past the point into that. And I said to myself, Harold, you're seeing things, because Niels Halverson would not do that. He was quiet. Come morning. There was a bicycle laying at the head of the dock, in the grass, tipped over, like somebody stepped off it in a hurry. Ingrid kept her voice level. Whose bicycle? Now that's it. See? Harold Pearson looked at her, and his eyes, buried in 90 years of folds, were suddenly clear and sharp as ice water. I knew that bicycle. Everybody knew that bicycle. Green Schwinn with a big wire basket on the front, it carried the altar flowers to Zion Lutheran every Sunday morning of the world. Walter Brandt bought it for the boy so he could do errands for the church. He turned his face to the road. I come back from my dinner that day. This is now the 10th. Mind, the whole town's down at the shore and the Coast Guard's up from Duluth and the bicycle's gone. Somebody come and took it, in the middle of a search for a drowned man, and nobody ever saw it again. Did you tell anyone? Told the deputy? Deputy wrote it in his little book. Harold shrugged, one shoulder, an old man's shrug, and in it was the whole sad machinery of a small town. Deputy's dead, books wherever them books go, and Walter Brandt held the paper on my station. Girl, same as he held paper on half this shore. A man thinks about a thing like that. I'm not proud of it. But I'll tell you what I've thought all these years, every time I drive past that church. And he nodded up the road, toward the white steeple of Zion Lutheran standing against the gray sky. I've thought that basket carried flowers to the altar on Sunday, and something else to the dock on Saturday night. And only one man in this town knows what. The third visit Ingrid made with her mother. Dorothy Lund had been postmistress of Kalvik from 1961 to 1994, and she received them in her kitchen because that is where Dorothy Lund had received the town's business, official and otherwise, for 80 years. She poured coffee, nobody drank. She was the same age as Edith. They had been girls together, and for 50 years there had been between them the specific, unbridgeable courtesy that grows between a woman and the people who pitied her. You want to ask me about the mail, Dorothy said. Before either of them had asked anything, she set the pot down. I always thought somebody would come and ask me about the mail. I thought it'd be a sight sooner. Whose mail? Edith said. Dorothy Lund sat down across from her and folded her hands and looked at them. You have to understand about a small post office, she said. You see everything. You say nothing. That's the whole job. I could tell you which marriages in this town died by mail and when. I never told a soul, and I'm not going to start. She stopped, and her folded hands tightened. But you can know a thing 40 years and not know you know it, until one day it stands up in you. Walter Brandt never mailed a letter in his life. You understand, big man like that, the feed store did its billing through the girl he employed, and church business went through the council, and Walter Brandt did not lick stamps. I'd have said he'd never stood in my line 5 times in 30 years. Then his boy goes off to that college in Winnipeg, and that winter December. This is 68 January. February of 69, I start seeing Walter's Fairlane go by the window. Tuesday mornings, mostly, going south. She looked up. There's nothing south, Edith, till Two Harbors, and the 3rd or 4th time. My sister, she worked the counter at the Two Harbors post office, then my sister mentions to me. Just gossiping. Isn't that the big feed store man from up your way? That comes into our window of a Tuesday, buys his international postage, and mails his letters here, and I remember laughing about it. Rich man too proud to lick a stamp in front of his neighbors. Dorothy's voice had gone very flat. Except I saw one of those letters myself. Once, I was in Two Harbors for the dentist and stepped in to see my sister, and Walter Brandt was at the counter ahead of me, and there was his envelope. Face up on the scale. I was a postmistress 40 years. Edith. You read an envelope the way other people read a headline. It was going to Ontario. The town I couldn't swear to now, but Ontario. Canada, plain as print. From a man whose son was supposed to be at Bible college in Winnipeg. She sat back. A man sends his son to college. He writes to him from his own town, proud as you please. He doesn't drive 22 miles every Tuesday for 30-odd years to keep a Canadian address out of the Kalvik post office where Dorothy Lund sorts the mail. There was a silence. 30 years, Edith said quietly. Edith. Dorothy looked at her, and her eyes were full. The last time I personally saw Walter Brandt's car go south of a Tuesday morning, I was retired, and it was 1996. They should have gone straight to the sheriff, or straight to Walter, afterward. Ingrid always thought so. Instead, because the shore is the shore. They went to see Oscar Vick, and Oscar Vick nearly broke her mother. Oscar was Arne's cousin, 86, the last man alive who had fished beside Niels Halverson, and they found him mending net in his boathouse for a boat he no longer owned, because that is what his hands knew. He was glad to see them. He talked about Niels for an hour, and it was water in the desert nobody had talked to Edith about Niels, the actual man, in decades. How he sang in Norwegian when the catch was good, terribly, like a gull in a bucket. How he'd once towed the Sorensen boys' swamped skiff 11 miles in a fog by compass and stubbornness. And then, warm and loosened and wandering among his dead, Oscar Vick said the thing he had carried for 50 years and thought, by now, was safe to set down. "You know, I never believed it," he said, pulling twine. "What they said, that he run off. Niels never. I always figured it was the other thing." He shook his head comfortably. "The money thing." The boathouse got very quiet. Oscar looked up and saw their faces and understood, too late, that it had not been safe to set down at all. "What money thing, Oscar?" Edith said. He tried to wave it off, and could not. He was too old and too honest, and too far in. "It was just talk. Winter after. Fellow at the co-op, and one of the Coast Guard boys. That kind of talk." His hands had stopped moving. "That Niels was paid for whatever he went out to do that night. That somebody put real money in front of him, enough for the boat note, enough to clear him, and that's why a smart man went out into a November gale, because he wasn't being brave. See, he was being bought." Oscar looked at Edith with an old man's terrible, helpless sorrow. "I never repeated it, Edie. I swear before God, I never once repeated it," Edith said. "No, nobody ever repeated anything. Not once." Her voice did not rise at all, which was the frightening thing. It came out level as a dial tone. The whole town, not repeating things. My entire life. She stood up. She was steady. But Ingrid saw her hand find the back of the chair she'd been sitting in, the knuckles whitening on it. Because here was the trap, and it had teeth. The new facts fit the old poison. A boy smuggled aboard. A secret errand. Walter Brandt's furtive envelopes. You could read the whole thing, if you wanted. As a transaction, not a husband lost doing a decency, but a man taking dirty money to run a draft dodger to Canada. Dead in a business deal gone wrong in the weather. The town would like that story even better than the old one. It had a villain and a wage. And the awful thing, the thing Edith could not say aloud to her daughter in the truck going home, was this: 51 years of anyone's faith develops hairline cracks, and the money story ran straight into hers like water finding a seam. Would he? For her, for the baby coming, for the boat note that was drowning them, for the truck the bank took anyway that March might have looked at a fat envelope on a stormy night and decided that one run, 1 hour, could buy his family clear. She sat in the dark truck with her hands in her lap while the shore ran past, and for the first time since 1968, she allowed the question all the way in. And it was worse than the whispers had ever been, because this time the whisper was in her own voice. At the house, Ingrid killed the engine and they sat. "Mom," Ingrid said, "there's one man who knows what happened on that dock. He's 90 years old, and he's 10 minutes up this road, and I'm done doing arithmetic." Edith looked at the front window of her house, where the shape of the chair stood black against the lamp she'd left burning. "Tomorrow," she said. "I've waited 51 years. He can have one more night's sleep. It'll be his last good one." Walter Brandt had outlived the town he ruled. The feed store had been a Dollar General for 20 years. The Council of Zion Lutheran was run by women whose mothers he had condescended to. What remained of Walter Brandt at 90 was housed in a sunny corner room of the Lakeview home in Two Harbors, 2 floors and 1 long hallway from Miss Carlson, though neither had ever sought the other out, and what remained was still, unmistakably, Walter shaved, pressed, upright in his chair by the window with a large print Bible on the table beside him, squared to the table's edge. He knew them the moment they came in. Ingrid saw it the flicker, instantly mastered. He had been waiting for this visit, she realized, in some back room of himself, for decades, and now that it had come, he received it the way he had received everything in his life, as a matter to be presided over. "Edith," he said, "and Ingrid, sit down. I heard, of course, about the boat." His voice at 90 was a ruin of the pulpit baritone, but the cadence survived, the deliberateness, every sentence laid like brick. A hard mercy. After so long, I have prayed for you both since. Whose flashlight was the second flashlight? Walter, Edith said. She had not sat down. The room was quiet. Down the hall, a television murmured. Walter Brandt looked at Edith Halverson for a long moment, and Ingrid watched him do arithmetic of his own, what was known, what could be known, what the boat had held on to. He looked at his hands. So, he said at last, it kept the chest. Hearing him say it flat, factual, the chest, its existence conceded like an invoice, did something to the air in the room. Ingrid heard her mother's breath go out of her once, slowly, through her nose. I will tell you, Walter said. What I know. I'm 90 years old, and my son has not spoken to me since 1968, and I find the first crack, hairline, mortared over immediately. I find I no longer care to hold it, but you will hear all of it in order, Edith, because in order is the only way it is bearable. And he told them, in order, in brick. Thomas's notice had come on the 11th of October, 1968, report for induction. You will not understand what that paper was in this house, Walter said. I had built that boy toward manhood his whole life. Duty was the spine of everything I ever taught, at that table, in that church. And my son sat across from me with his supper going cold and told me he would not go. Not could not, would not. He said, Walter's jaw worked. He said he would not kill farmers in their own country for men in neckties, and if it meant prison, he would go to prison, and if it meant Canada, he would go to Canada, and he would rather be a coward alive than my idea of a man. We didn't shout. I want that understood. In my house we didn't shout. I told him he would report as ordered or he was no son of mine, and he looked at me. He was 19. He had never once defied me, and he looked at me like a man looking at a wall. He's already climbed, and I saw that I had lost, that he was going to Canada. The only question left in the world was whether he arrived. Ingrid said, quietly, the border's a road, Walter. People drove across it every day. The watched people, Walter said, with a flash of the old contempt, drove across it into a checkpoint with their induction date in a federal ledger. He was flagged the day he failed to report. Any crossing. They'd have his name. And the men who ran boys up through the woods and the back roads charged for it. And they were the kind of men who charged twice. He shook his head once. But a fishing boat out of Calvik meets a Canadian boat on open water, at night, past the line, no road, no checkpoint, no ledger. It had been done. It was being done, up and down that shore, more than this town will ever say out loud. And there was exactly one man on this water good enough to do it in November, and I had stood in his church every Sunday of his life. The room was very still now. I went to him on the 8th, not the 9th, the 8th, the Friday. I stood in his boat shed, in the smell of his nets, and I asked him, and he said no. Walter looked up, and there was something in his ruined face that was almost horribly pride. You should know that, Edith. Your husband said no, immediately, without heat, the way a man declines a second helping. He said, I have a wife with a child coming. Walter, find another way. And He stopped. You offered him money, Edith said. I put an envelope on his workbench, said Walter Brandt, with more money in it than his boat cost new, and I told him what it would clear, because I had made it my business to know what he owed, to the dollar. Ingrid heard her own pulse. Here it was the seam, the crack, the co-op story with its teeth. And he looked at that envelope. Walter went on, and now his voice had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere he clearly had not permitted it to go in 50 years. For a long time. And then he looked at me, and whatever he saw fit to say next, whatever passed on that dock the following night, whatever a frightened father did or did not put into a dead man's hands, he stopped himself, his mouth closed. Walter, Edith's voice was ash-quiet. Did my husband take your money? I have told you what I know in order. Walter Brandt said. The next night the weather was moving in, and it was the storm or wait a week for the moon to darken again. And a week he didn't have, the marshals had already been to the school asking after him. My son rode his bicycle to that dock at 9 o'clock. I did not go down. 2 shapes were a risk and 3 were madness. I gave the boy his chest and money in his coat and my hand to shake because I could not but the second crack, wider. I could not manage the other thing, and I stood at the top of the hill by the church in the wind, in the dark, like a thief in my own town, and I watched the Solveig's lights go out past the point, and that is the last thing I know on this earth. I never saw the boat again. I never saw Niels again. What happened on that water, I do not know, and I have not known since.
and not knowing has been my attitude.
Don't, Edith said. Say penance. Ushchimeus. The word stopped him like a slap. You want to know what I know? Walter, in order. She still had not sat down. She stood in the middle of his sunny room in her gray coat like a winter that had come indoors. I know that in March the bank took my truck, and your feed store held the note on half this town, and you never lifted a finger or a telephone. I know that when the whispers started, he ran off. There was a woman they suited you, didn't they? Every year this town spent looking at my husband's ghost. It wasn't looking at your son's empty pew. I know you stood up in Zion Lutheran, over my head, over my daughter's head, year upon year upon year, and preached about men who abandoned their obligations. I was speaking of myself. It came out of him like something bursting, and it silenced the room. And Walter Brandt sat there shocked at his own voice, an old man's spotted hands trembling on the arms of his chair. Every time, he said, barely audible. Every time. Edith, who did you think the sermon was for? Then you should have said your own name. Edith said, you had 50 years of Sundays to say your own name, and you let them say mine. Walter Brandt looked at her, and then his face did the thing Ingrid would remember longest. It closed, visibly. Whatever had burst had cost him more than he had, and the presiding self reassembled over the breach, brick by brick. And when he spoke again, it was the pulpit voice, dead level. I do not know what happened on the water. I do not know what passed between them about the money, and I will not speculate about a dead man's honor. I know my son lived, because letters came. I know your husband did not. Everything else in this town is gossip, Edith, and I have given you everything that isn't. Now I am tired, and I would like you to leave. And that was all. The door had shut. They stood in the parking lot afterward in the cold October sun, and Ingrid was shaking with fury, and Edith was not shaking at all, which was worse, because he had given them everything except the only thing. Did he take the money? The old man either didn't know or wouldn't say. And so the question rode home with them in the truck like a passenger, and sat with Edith at her dark kitchen table half that night, her kneels, and the envelope on the workbench, and 51 years of a faith with a seam in it. It was the church ledgers. In the end, it was Ingrid being her mother's daughter and an accountant. The memorial for Niels was Pastor Dahl's idea, a proper one this time. The town's apology dressed as a service, and Ingrid was in the church office helping the treasurer pull records for the anniversary bulletin when she found it the benevolence ledgers, decades of them, and in every single volume, quarter after quarter, the same entry in the same successive secretary's hands. Mission Support Emmanuel Lutheran Church, Nipigon, Ontario, modest sums, utterly regular, beginning in the first quarter of 1969. Zion Lutheran of Kalvik had no mission relationship with any church in Nipigon, Ontario. No one on the council knew what the entry was. It had simply always been there, like the roof proposed. The oldest minutes showed. In February 1969, by the chairman of the Benevolence Committee, W. Brandt, funded. The treasurer confirmed after an hour of cross-referencing that made her go quiet, by an anonymous annual gift that matched it to the dollar. Year after year after year, a rich man too proud to lick a stamp laundering his love for his son through the collection plate. Ingrid sat in the church office with decades of ledgers around her and looked up Emmanuel Lutheran Church of Nipigon, Ontario, on her phone, a clapboard building on a bluff over Lake Superior, the same lake, she thought, the same cold water, 300 miles up the far shore, a part-time number. She called it from the church office phone, standing up. The pastor who answered was young and knew nothing, but he was kind. And when she said the name Brandt, he said, "Oh, you'd want Pastor Loken. He had this parish 40 years. He's retired here in town," and gave her the number. And Pastor Emeritus Anders Loken listened to Ingrid Halverson's careful, level, 20-minute account of 51 years without interrupting once. Then he was silent so long she thought the line had dropped. "I always wondered," the old pastor said at last, "what Tom Brandt was to that man in Minnesota who sent the money and never came. He called the parsonage, twice a year, maybe, for decades, always the same. I won't keep you. Pastor, is Tom Brandt well? Is he working? Does he want for anything? Never may I speak with him. Never once, in 40 years. A long breath down 300 miles of wire. I would tell him, Walter, he's here Sundays. I could walk the phone to him, and he would say, that wouldn't be right, and thank me, and hang up.
I used to sit and wonder what on earth a man had done, that he'd built a wall like that and then paid, all his life, to keep a window in it.
"Pastor," Ingrid said, "is Thomas Brandt still there? Is he alive?" Tom lives 4 streets from me. He rebuilt the church hall roof with his own hands the year I retired. He is the finest carpenter and the saddest man in Nipigon, Ontario. And in 40 years, Miss Halverson, he has never once told me why." A pause. "I take it you're going to ask me to walk something over to him?" "No, sir," Ingrid said. She looked through the office door, across the sanctuary, at the 3rd pew from the back, on the left. "Just a message. Just tell him Edith Halverson is still at the same house, and the same number, and the lake gave the Solveig back. He can decide the rest himself. He's had 51 years to decide the rest. Tell him this is the last easy chance he'll ever get." The call came on a Sunday evening. 2 days later, Edith was alone in the kitchen. Ingrid had driven down to Duluth for clothes and her mail. The dishes were done. The lamp in the front room was lit. The phone on the kitchen wall, she had never changed it. The same beige wall phone with the long cord rang at 12 minutes past 7, and Edith dried her hands and answered it the way she had answered that phone 10,000 times. "Halverson." Silence. Not deadline silence, breathing silence. The silence of someone standing at the top of a very high dive. And then a voice she had never heard. An old man's voice, worn and slow and carrying half a century in it like silt. "Mrs. Halverson, my name is Thomas Brandt." A breath. "I've been trying to make this call for 51 years. Edith pulled the kitchen chair over by its back, the cord stretching, and sat down slowly, and said the only thing there was to say. "Tell me." And Thomas Brandt told her. "I was on the dock at 9, he said. "It was blowing so hard I had to lean my bike into it, and I laid it down in the grass and your husband was already there, in the slip, with the engine warming, and my father came down out of the dark behind me. He'd said he wouldn't come, and then he couldn't help it, and the last thing my father did was try one more time to put that envelope in your husband's hands." I want you to hear this part the way I saw it, Mrs. Halverson, because I have kept it 51 years like a coal in my 2 hands. Your husband was checking the fuel line. He straightened up, and my father held the envelope out into the light of the dock lamp and said something about the boat note he'd found out what you owed. He thought everything was a note that could be paid, and Niels looked at that envelope, and then he took it. And I remember my stomach dropping. I remember thinking, oh, the way a kid thinks when he sees an adult be smaller than he believed. And Niels folded it once and pushed it back into my father's coat, into the breast of his coat, hard, flat, with his whole hand like a man closing a door, and he said, "Keep it, Walter, I'm not doing this for you." And my father, nobody talked to my father like that. You understand, nobody in my life ever. My father just stood there, and Niels picked up my chest and swung it aboard like it was nothing and looked at me. And he said, the voice on the phone stopped. Edith sat with her eyes shut in her yellow kitchen. He said, "Get aboard, Tom. No boy ought to die in another man's jungle." And that was all the reason he ever gave anybody, ma'am. That was the whole price. Outside her window, the bay lay in the last light, and Edith Halverson, 72 years old, put her free hand flat on her own breastbone and pressed, and let Thomas Brandt keep talking, because he had carried it too long, and it was coming now like water through a failed seawall. He told her about the crossing, 4 hours that should have been 2, the Solveig climbing seas the size of houses in the dark, green water coming over the bow, Niels at the wheel, unhurried, planted, now and then shouting something that was almost cheerful. "She's built for this, Tom. She's Norwegian. Sit down before you go over." And Thomas, 19, seasick, terrified, huddled in the cabin with his life vest cinched down small because Niels had taken one look at him on the dock and rerun every strap himself, snug, checking the buckles the way you'd check a child's. He told her about the lights, the Canadian boat, a big steel tug out of Rossport, holding position past the line with her deck lights burning, and the 2 boats coming together in that sea, like threading a needle on horseback. Mrs. Halverson, I have never seen anything like it since. What that man did with that boat, hulls rising and falling out of phase, fenders screaming, and one moment, when the rails came level. He stripped my vest off me first. The cork was a barrel no man on that tug could have caught me in it. 2 buckles, and it was off my back. And he took one turn of line and lashed it to the rail so the wind wouldn't have it all of that in seconds. In that sea. Like he'd rehearsed it his whole life. And then he didn't warn me. There wasn't time to be warned. He had me by the collar and the belt, and he said, "Now, and I was in the air. Their deckhand caught me like a sack of feed, and I turned around to say, I don't know what. Thank you. Something. I turned around to say it, and the sea had already shoved the boats apart, 10 feet, 20, and my chest was still sitting on his deck, and my vest was still lashed to his rail. And I remember screaming about it, screaming about my chest like a fool, like it mattered. And Nils was back at the wheel already, bringing her bow around into it. And he leaned out of the cabin door into the wind, and he put one hand up to his mouth, and he shouted. Thomas Brandt stopped. Edith heard him breathing. She realized she was gripping the phone with both hands now, the way you grip a rail. He shouted, tell my wife I turned back. The kitchen was absolutely silent. The bay was absolutely silent. 51 years came down to the hum of a phone line. Those were the last words, Thomas said, and now his old voice was shaking openly. Of the finest man I ever knew, and they were for you, Mrs. Halverson. They were only ever for you, and I am the only living soul who heard them. And God help me, I never brought them to you. Why? It was all she could manage, and it was the only question left. Because I was 19 and a coward. Oh, no, ma'am, you've been given 50 years of half-truths and you won't get another one from me. He gathered himself. She heard it. The first years, I was afraid. That part's true. I'd have been arrested at the border. There were men who got mailed back, and my father wrote to me every week. Those envelopes. Return postage folded inside, and he told me the search had found nothing. And then he told me a thing I believed because I wanted to. He told me that you knew. That he had gone to you privately and told you everything. And that you had asked you, Mrs. Halverson, that it never be spoken of, for the baby's sake. So the government never came asking how your husband died running a fugitive. He told me writing to you would be a cruelty, that my silence was a mercy you had requested. Edith shut her eyes. And I believed that for, I'd like to say a few years, I believed it as long as it was easy to believe. There came a day I was 30. Maybe when I understood, sitting in the Nipigon church of all places, that it had the shape of one of my father's arrangements, that he'd built me a silence and told me it was yours. And Mrs. Halverson, this is the part I have to say. And then you can hang up this phone and never think of me again. I did nothing. I had an address. I had 30 more years and a telephone in your name. And every year the calling got harder, because every year the silence I'd have to explain got longer. And shame compounds. Ma'am, like interest. You wait 1 year and you owe 2. My father silenced me when I was 19. The old voice came apart, quietly, completely. After that, I silenced myself. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the light was going off the water. Edith looked down the hall, through the front room, at the chair standing black against the window, and past it, through the glass, to the mouth of the bay, the dark seam of water inside the point, not a mile away, where the Solveig had lain all that time. Inside the point, she heard her own voice come out of her, strange and slow. The bay, she said. They found her inside the bay, Thomas, 200 yards off this dock. Ma'am? He made it back, Edith said. Across all of it, all those hours alone, in that sea. He crossed the whole of it and rounded the point. And he was. Her hand went to her mouth. The last cruelty and the last gift arrived together, the same fact wearing both faces. He was 200 yards from this window. I was sitting in it. Thomas. I was sitting right here in this chair with the lamp lit, watching for him, and he could see it. He was that close. He would have been able to see my light. On the other end of the line, 300 miles up the far shore of the same lake, an old carpenter wept like a boy. Then he died looking at it, Thomas Brandt said. Ma'am, he died coming home, with your light in his eyes. It took me 51 years to bring you 6 words, and I will be sorry for that until they bury me, but you have them now. He turned back, and he nearly made it, and there was never one moment, not one. I was there when that man was ever going anywhere but home to you. Thomas Brandt came home to Kalvik on the second Saturday of November, 51 years to the day, driving down around the head of the lake through the first real snow. He was 70 years old, tall and stooped, with his father's height and none of his father's bearing, and he sat in the last pew of Zion Lutheran at the memorial service for Nils Halverson with his cap in his 2 hands. unrecognized by nearly everyone and stared at by the 3 or 4 old enough to see the ghost in his face. The church was full. The town had come to apologize the only way a town knows how, with a casserole schedule and full pews, and Pastor Dahl kept his part brief. And Ingrid read the 93rd Psalm, "The sea is mighty. But the Lord on high is mightier," in a steady voice with her chin up, the way you read when you are reading at your father's funeral 50 years late. And then, in the pause after the psalm, in his front pew, Walter Brandt put both hands on the rail ahead of him and hauled himself onto his feet. He had been brought from 2 Harbors by the Holmes van, in his good suit. Nobody had asked him to speak. A rustle of pure alarm went through the church. He stood very bent, gripping the pew rail, facing mostly forward, and he said, in the ruin of the old pulpit voice, 5 sentences. "Niels Halverson went on to the lake that night because I begged him to save my son's life. He would not take my money. He did it for nothing. Because he was a better man than I am. I let this town believe otherwise for 51 years, to keep my own house respectable. And every sermon I ever gave about faithless men, I was giving about myself." He paused, swaying slightly, his knuckles white on the rail. "That is all. That is the whole of it. I wanted to say it under this roof." No one moved. No one breathed. He lowered himself back down by his arms, an old man alone in a front pew, and the silence in Zion Lutheran was total, not forgiving, not condemning, just total, the sound of a town swallowing its own story whole. Afterward, on the steps, in the snow, he waited for her. Of course he did. He had presided over every occasion of his life, and he would preside over this one. His own reckoning, propped on a walker in the cold. The crowd made the space around them without seeming to, the way crowds do. "Edith," Walter Brandt said. She stopped. She looked at him a moment, the whole of him. The suit. The walker. The son standing far off at the bottom of the steps, who had traveled 300 miles and still, even now, had not crossed the last 10 feet to his father. "You should have told me before my daughter learned to walk," Edith said. Then she took her daughter's arm and went down the steps past him, and did not look back, and left him standing at the top in the falling snow with his confession, which was his to keep now, the way the waiting had been hers. The conservation crew found the last thing the following Wednesday. The Solvay stood on her cribbing in the boatyard under a rented shelter, and the museum people were working her slowly, plank by plank. And midway through that week, they removed a section of the cabin's forward bulkhead that the sinking had buckled inward. Behind it, jammed down between 2 frames and buried in solidified silt, was a small steel toolbox, its lid rusted shut, its seams packed tight with clay. They ground it open on the bench. Inside, the clay had not reached. Inside there was a nest of oilcloth, wrapped and tied with wax twine, tied the way a fisherman ties, and the conservator, a young woman who did not yet know the whole story, unwrapped it with gloved hands while the crew chief went to the office to telephone the Halverson house. Edith and Ingrid drove down together. The boatyard was quiet. The crew had, with rough grace, found other things to do. The oilcloth lay open on the workbench under the shop light. It was a little boat, 10 inches of clear pine, carved and sanded and true, a small double-ended fishing boat. Unmistakably the Solveig herself, her sheer line, her proud bow, every strake suggested by a knife stroke sure as handwriting. She had been painted, and the painting was unfinished, the hull white below, and above it one side wore a coat of fresh blue, while the other side was still bare wood. The job interrupted mid-stroke on a Saturday night in 1968, a Saturday night promise of Sunday work. And on the bare side, up near the bow, carved shallow and fine and filled with a single line of black paint so it would never wear away, was a small bird, a swallow, wings open, and beneath the swallow, in careful knife-cut letters, a 1/4 inch tall, a name. Ingrid, he had known. All that October, whittling by the kerosene lamp, hiding it behind his back, grinning. Not yet he had already chosen. Ingrid, if it's a girl, and he'd carved the name in advance like a man betting on his own heart. He had carried it down to the boathouse himself that last Saturday afternoon to lay on the first coat of blue, and stowed it in the toolbox aboard, out of his wife's reach. To be finished on Sunday after church, and their wedding anniversary had been the following Friday, the 15th of November, and no one had ever had to explain any of that to Edith, and no one ever would. Ingrid Halvorsen, 50 years old, stood in a cold boatyard shed holding the only thing her father ever gave her, and found that she could not see it anymore. And her mother took it gently out of her hands before it could fall. The chair went back to being a chair on a Sunday in late November. Ingrid had stayed up from Duluth, and her son had driven over from Grand Rapids with his wife and the two little ones. And the Halvorsen house was loud for the first time in decades, potatoes boiling, a grandchild being chased down the hall, Ingrid calling out that the table wanted setting. Edith stood in the front room in the smell of supper and the failing light. The little boat sat on the windowsill now, where the lamp used to burn. She had set it there the day they brought it home, bare side out. Unfinished side out, she would not have it painted, ever. Some things are truer interrupted, and the evening light came in low off the water and lay along the small carved letters of her daughter's name. Edith touched the boat once, lightly, with 2 fingers, on the Swallow. She looked out the window, down the long gray reach of the bay, to the mouth of it, to the dark water inside the point. Then she took hold of the back of the chair with both hands and turned it slowly, all the way around until it faced the lit kitchen and the set table, and the noise. Its legs scraped across the old floorboards. "Ma," Ingrid called from the kitchen. "Supper!"